Hey folks, how's it going? My name's Eric. I'm the curator here at Seven Oaks House Museum. And we're really excited to be doing this project, the Safe at Home Museum, coming live to all you folks today. It's really awesome for us because the museum here is normally closed during the winter. Nobody gets to see this kind of thing, so it's a lot of fun to put on our coats, get our gloves on, and get to show you this stuff when most people wouldn't get to see it. So Seven Oaks House here is actually the oldest home in Winnipeg. These little buildings next to it are the oldest buildings of any kind in all of Winnipeg too. Very, very cool piece of history. So let's come on inside and I'll tell you a little bit about the family that lived here. So you can see right here the Inkster Sinclair family. They were both really prominent families here in early Manitoba. John Inkster here came from the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. He immigrated back in the 1820s to settle here. And his wife, Mary Sinclair, she was of Orkney Scottish Métis ancestry. Her mother had Cree background. And they met here in northern Manitoba during the fur trade. And they became a really powerful kind of political and influential trade family during the fur trade. That's really how the family became known, and they had a big impact on the city's development here. I won't really get too much into all of their stories, but we're very fortunate in that we have artifacts, objects in this house, the house where they lived, that belong to the family. We still have them here in the museum, and so throughout our visits this month, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stories as they relate to these people and relate to our home here. So without further ado, let's go check out the collection. So I'm going to take off my outdoor gloves and put on my curator's gloves here. Now, the Inksters, they were a very interesting family, and every family has their stories, right? Today we're talking kind of about family heirlooms, in a sense, and heirlooms can take a lot of forms, right? Many of us have photos like I showed there, we might have letters or documents, but we also have these very different personal objects, and they all tell a really, really important part of our family's story. And it's important that we protect that history, The only reason we can talk about the Inksters today is because their family, their children valued these things and they valued their stories. And they took steps to preserve them, basically. So today we all get to enjoy this wonderful museum built way back in 1851. So it's a very, very cool place. Now, I'm going to start out with this guy here. This is the Inkster family's photo album. We'll get some close-ups added here, but this one is actually a picture of one of the Inkster's daughters, Ellen Inkster, that you saw out there. This is the original photo. And it's very unique. It's quite rare and very cool to have this album. It shows some of the Inkster family members, but it also shows other people that the Inksters knew. Some of them are very famous Manitobans. There's a guy named James Ross in here. The Ross family's house is also a museum over in Point Douglas. But James Ross is most famous for working with Louis Riel. He actually represented the English Métis community. He was one of the founding fathers of Manitoba. So we have these original photos that the Inksters saved that were given to them, but there's a problem. You might notice there are no captions, right? None of these photos, virtually none of these photos are identified. We don't know who these people are, even if they are historically significant. People didn't necessarily write on their photos. Many of us don't today because we just take for granted we know those people. But when these things become a historical document, that information can be lost forever, right? The other kind of sad thing is that from being stored in this album and from being displayed, some of them have faded, being exposed to light. You always want to keep your photos somewhere safe and dark. And they've also been damaged from being leafed through. So, they weren't really thinking about preservation. They were treating these as a normal object in a sense. But here, this letter is kind of another cool sort of historical document of a very different sort. It's a literal document, right? But this is a letter that was written by one of the Inkster's daughters to one of their other daughters. Her husband was a fur trader with the Hudson's Bay Company, and they had moved off at this time, I believe, to northern Saskatchewan, around the Île-la-Crosse area. Now, the letter itself is pretty interesting in terms of what it says. They're just kind of talking about their daily affairs, but you can sort of get from this that there was a fire in their house, actually, and that they blamed the maid for it. And we only have a part of the letter, so we don't get the whole story, but it's an interesting little snippet into their lives, and it's the kind of history that you would never find in like an official history book, right? This very personal kind of story. But beyond what the letter itself says, what's really interesting about it you might notice it looks kind of like scribbles, and that's because the text runs in two directions. It goes horizontally here like a normal letter, and it also runs vertically on the next side. It's signed here, Ellen Inkster. That's the woman whose photo I showed you. Now, this was actually something that was very commonly done in the 19th century. You can see it again here. Imagine getting this letter and trying to read this. It actually took us hours and hours of work to interpret this. The reason people did this was to save paper and to save on postage. It's hard to imagine this today, right? But at this time in the mid-19th century, paper was incredibly expensive. It had to actually be made by hand. It wasn't necessarily done here. A lot of it was shipped from places like the east coast of the US, New York, or all the way from London. Now, we'll see if we can get a better close-up of this, but the reason I'm holding this up to the light like this, there's actually a watermark. The paper is stamped 1865, and it has the manufacturer's name on it. This is how special paper was. It was actually signed by the manufacturer who made it so that you knew it wasn't counterfeit. So people knew that paper was precious, and postage was done by weight. So if you added another page to your letter, it would cost twice as much to send it. If you could double your message by crisscrossing like that, then you could save in two ways. So it's actually very common, and it's a really, really cool thing now. You know, in this time where we're all on Facebook Live, right? We're broadcasting this on Zoom. It's hard to imagine saving that money on that piece of paper, right? By making your letter illegible. But even a family like the Inksters that were very wealthy did that kind of stuff. Now, I should probably introduce where we are too. I talked about the house a little bit, but this is a room that we call the parlor. The parlor is basically like the living room that we would have in our home today. This is the public area of the house, and it was usually the fanciest area of the house too. They have these beautiful, basically velvet chenille kind of curtains imported from France. Families would really show off their wealth in a place like this to impress visitors. Now, over here, we actually come, for me, to one of the most interesting stories that we have in the family. You know, photographs are an obvious memento, right? Many of us save those. Letters, another obvious one that we save. But over here, this jewelry is a very different kind of memento of family. All of this jewelry here is actually made completely out of human hair. It's really hard to believe, I know, and a lot of people find it kind of creepy. If you believe in ghosts in a museum, these are probably the most likely things to be possessed as far as an object goes, right? A piece of a person. But at that time, these were a really, really popular art form that was used to remember loved ones, basically. Up until the 1860s, you virtually could not get a photo here in Manitoba. Up until the late 19th century, only wealthy families like the Inksters could afford them, and you had to go to a studio, you had to pose. So you might have one or two pictures of your family, right? You wouldn't have snapshots on your phone like we do today. So people found other ways of remembering family. This little piece here, and I promise we will zoom in for a little close-up here, is a brooch. And it was a brooch that belonged to one of the Inkster women, Mary Inkster, the mother of the family here. And it contains a woman's hair. It's a little braid of dark hair that's been braided and put under the glass there, almost like a locket. Now, we don't know whose hair it is exactly, but we think it could have been her mother's, or certainly another very close family member that was related to her. Now, again, in this time before photos, you needed to remember family members, right? If you moved to another country, you would probably never see your family again. It took months on a boat to get back to England. You might not have that photo. Letters, again, incredibly expensive, so contact was limited and you had to treasure those people however you could. So this piece of hair was a way of keeping them with you. You know, it started off in the early 19th century with these brooches like this, but later people got sort of carried away and they started making extremely elaborate jewelry out of this. You can see this delicately woven and twisted braided kind of form in the bracelets, and also these really incredible open kind of mesh-like earrings. It's really impressive. And people mostly didn't do this stuff at home. There were actually professional hair workers that had workshops that would make it for you. There was a time you could even send your hair into Sears, actually, and they guaranteed on the ad, you will get your family's hair back. I guess there were, you know, unscrupulous people who were stealing hair or something like that. But the fear was there, and you actually mailed these things off, basically, to be made. And then, you know, they usually became treasured family heirlooms. This piece over here next to it, though, is sort of a different form of hair work. You can see it's this really elaborate wreath here. Now again, this is 100% human hair, just attached with wires basically. And so people would collect hair from the whole family. There's brown, there's black, there's blonde, there's gray, and those all came from a different person. They wouldn't have been dyed. You would have saved that hair up for months, maybe even for years to make a work like this, and then spend hundreds of hours weaving and twisting and bending it to make a wreath of this nature. And these would be shown off in the home, in the parlor like this. And again, it was basically like a family portrait. It's hard to think about, I realize, but in a time before photography, this was your family portrait. It represented grandma, it represented the children, and it was a beautiful object that lasted forever. Now we find them a little strange, but it's a really, really cool history, I think. Now I'm just going to kind of switch sides here to talk about my favorite story and the last one for today. So museums often have historical stories about people, right? We have houses dedicated to famous people, we remember them, we name buildings after them, but it's not so often that you have a museum celebrating the story of a famous dog. But luckily enough, that's actually what we have here. So this guy here is Bob's the dog. It's a funny name, maybe his tail kind of bobbed and wagged along as he walked, but that's what he was called. The Inksters lived with him. I don't like saying owned for pets, and it's obvious that they valued him, they really cared deeply about him and saw him as a member of the family. It's very, very neat and unusual to have this kind of a portrait. It shows how important Bob's was, and it shows how rich the Inksters were. That in a time when most people couldn't get photos of themselves, their families, the Inksters went to a studio and they had this posed portrait of Bob's looking regal on a bearskin rug, right? I think that's quite neat. But what makes it even cooler, and the reason that I know this is not just some photo of some dog, is that we actually have Bob's collar here. This is a dog collar that we think it's probably from like the 1890s, maybe the turn of the century. But it's this really nice hand-worked leather collar with this brass plaque on it. And the brass plaque actually says, Bob's in big black letters, 7 Oaks. So this for me is a super special object because it's telling the story of this dog, which is already unique. It's giving us his name so that we can confirm it's him based on this photo. And it's also showing us that even at the time the Inksters lived here, they called this house 7 Oaks. Today it's 7 Oaks House at 7 Oaks House Museum. But it's very neat to know that in the 19th century, people named their homes, almost like an estate you would see back in England. They didn't have street addresses necessarily, so they named the place. The Inksters called it 7 Oaks, and even today, almost 170 years later, we're calling it the same thing. So I hope you enjoyed these stories. I find them kind of heartwarming, which is important because it's freezing cold in here and I'm starting to lose feeling in my fingers. But I hope you appreciated them. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you folks next week.